Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. In this episode, we will investigate the idea of Blitzkrieg, with the stunning victories of German arms from 1939 to 1941, the result of a brilliant and new military concept. Is the Blitzkrieg label a myth echoing Nazi propaganda? And what are the military roots of this Blitzkrieg and the associated doctrine? Hi Jesse, good to be back. Good to see you and to hear you. Today talking about Blitzkrieg. I guess everybody who's ever dealt with World War II has heard the term, has got a rough understanding of what Blitzkrieg really means, what this concept really is. So let's dig in a bit deeper and let's more than just scratch the surface and as we always do, look at some of these myths that are surrounding all these ideas and concepts. So maybe perhaps you could just talk us through it and tell us what your idea, your understanding of Blitzkrieg and some of the underlying concepts really is.
Yeah, hi Matthias. I think this is important to start with the idea, the concept. What are we talking about? Because it's super easy, and you hear this on YouTube and on podcasts all the time, is you set up a straw man. Right? Everybody, you start talking about a concept and then you label it as something quite far from a useful definition, right? So we're going to try not to do that with Blitzkrieg. Or if listeners out there, you feel like we're setting up a straw man, at least we're going to be transparent about it. So let's put it that way. We're doing the best we can here. So let's start off. When most people think of Blitzkrieg, in your daily life, you're having a coffee, you're walking down the street, you hear the word Blitzkrieg, as one does. What goes through one's mind? And I would say it's more or less these elements. So literally, of course, the word in German, Blitz means lightning, Krieg means war, Krieg, if you're from Vienna, shout out to the Viennese out there.
Good Austrian pronunciation there. Yeah. That's the Austrian coming through in you.
So it literally means lightning war. And it's usually used to refer to the victories of Nazi Germany at the beginning of World War II, 1939 to 41, especially in Poland, France, and then the first part of the Russian campaign, the Operation Barbarossa, in summer 1941. And basically what's happening, what the German military is doing that causes us to associate with this idea of Blitzkrieg is that they use armored and motorized formations, which are not the whole army, but we'll get to that later. Armor and motorized formations with tactical air support, and they smash through one part or several points of the defender's line, then penetrate and outflank the defender or encircle groups of the defender, while at the same time, because they're running around behind enemy lines, causing all sorts of confusion, paralyzing enemy command and control through the speed of their movement. And this means that they're doing all this with a lot of initiative from lower level commanders. By lower level, I don't mean, NCOs, we mean divisional commanders or what have you. And that they need to have very effective communication to do this. I think in a nutshell, that's kind of the idea of Blitzkrieg that is out there. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
I think you're absolutely right. And in my teaching, when I lecture the army or different nationalities, of course, this whole idea of Blitzkrieg and some of the surrounding ideas that we will unpack as we go through today's episode, of course, is always there. And the picture that I always paint is where you can imagine that the enemy is like a body. And what you do is you try to paralyze the enemy's brains rather than really destroying or fighting the entire body. As you said, you try to break through the enemy lines. You take out the command post. You take out the headquarters. By that, you paralyze the enemy forces. And you can, to go doctrinally pure here, you can defeat the enemy rather than destroy, which means they're still there, but they can't fight anymore. So that's the whole idea behind it. And this is the concept in its purest form, you might say. And this is, of course, what the Germans do quite well at that particular stage. And because they do it quite well in the early stages of the war, not so much in the second half of the war, the Allies are quite confused about this. And they say, what is going on here? And where's all this coming from? And how can they have all these lightning victories? And a lot of people in those days, and of course even today, think that this is all brand new. They came up with this idea in the 1920s, particularly the 1930s. No one else knew how to do this. And because it is so groundbreakingly new, they can then achieve all these huge and stunning victories. So they're completely changing their doctrine. And of course, the one person that is really associated with this in this school of thought is, of course, Guderian, the tank general, who apparently comes up with this idea of a tank force, having read the British authors like Little Hart. He says, well, we need this, and he is the founding father of the German tank force, which then becomes the embodiment of this lightning war, the Blitzkrieg reality. As always, because our podcast is all about myth busting, it's all far more complex and very, very different. Say, if I just perhaps take one or two of these points, and then I'm throwing the ball back to you, Jesse. So maybe start with Guderian. Guderian is an important general. Yes, he is one of the driving generals behind the motorization, behind this whole idea of tank warfare. He is not the only one. The German army, particularly in the 1920s and also in the 1930s, is very open to new ideas. They look at what goes on around them. They read all the doctrine, all the pamphlets, all the writings from people like Little Hart and the British Army, but that's only one army. They look at everybody who's around them. And it's particularly after the war, after the Second World War, that this myth of Guderian is created. Because what happens is that Little Hart, who's the famous author in the UK, he's a captain actually, so not particularly senior and high-ranking, but he makes his name as a writer. And he convinces Guderian to basically mention him. So mention Little Hart in this translation of his works. And it's quite funny because when you look at the German original, Little Hart doesn't get mentioned at all, whereas he's always there in the English language translation. So you got this link there. And Guderian promotes himself during the rise of the Nazi Party and the Wehrmacht, the Second World War, and then, of course, also after the war. And he's quite successful in doing that, but he's not the only one who comes up with this idea. So here's just one of these great myths. There are some people who are at least as influential, perhaps even more influential than him. And that's just the one person, but there's lots to say about the concept itself. So, Jesse, over to you.
Right. I think now you've already started opening up a couple of cans of worms there in the first couple of minutes. I think because I've been living in a German-speaking environment for 15 years, I'm going to very briefly, before we delve into those cans of worms and a few others, lay out what I think we could call the myth about Blitzkrieg. Now, there's no question that the Germans actually do what we were describing just a few moments ago. They fight that way. But I think where the mythology comes in, and you've already started, as I say, to get into a couple of these, is on a few different levels. One is the idea that it's exclusively German. And you've already referenced that might not be the case. That it's brand new at the start of World War II. Again, you're already putting some cracks in that argument. That it is a kind of coherent doctrine and strategy that they have sat down, hashed out, and decided upon. That's something we're going to get into. And that it's kind of the brainchild of Guderian, which you just pretty effectively pulled the rug out from under that idea, let's say. So I think we're going to hit all those other aspects, right? Is it German? Is it new? Is it a coherent doctrine? And is it Guderian's? Well, I think we already can tick that one partially off the list. So in terms of, is it a German way to fight? Now, you've already referenced people like Little Hart, for example. We could also throw JFC Fuller into the mix. This guy's another thinker, theorist about armored warfare who is a proponent of creating armored divisions and mobile warfare. And he's writing all this stuff in the interwar period. So that concept that we associate with the way that the Germans fight in 39 to 41 is already something people are talking about, like Fuller. Now, Fuller, just for full disclosure here, he goes crazy in his non-military theorist parts of his life. So, and he's associated with the British fascist movement and so on. We have to kind of put that all out there. But as a military theorist, he's quite significant. Someone else, say on the Soviet side, like Mikhail Tukhachevsky, We've mentioned him on the podcast before. He's one of the people who's involved in developing the concept of deep battle, which is also about very deep penetrations behind enemy lines with armored forces and so on and so forth. And of course, in the English-speaking world, everybody's whipping boy, Charles de Gaulle, he is also writing about this kind of thing, saying France needs to develop fast-moving, modern, armored formations, and he will then get his chance to do some armored counterattacks in May 1940, but too late, right? So is this way of fighting exclusively German? I think the balance of evidence would definitely say no, not really. I don't know. Did I leave anybody out? Are there a couple of other aspects here that you wanna pick up on? But in terms of is it just German? I'd have to say I don't think so.
I think you're absolutely right. So I think you've mentioned all the important players internationally. You've thrown them all out there. We could probably do a podcast on each of them. That would be very, very interesting. I think what is interesting, but it's also a bit different when you look at the German case, is when you go back into the 1920s and the 1930s. And again, we can unpack even more of that, of the doctrinal piece and where it all comes from later on. But of course, what you do find in the German case at that particular point, when you look at these relatively new ideas and where they were really new or not, we'll look at that in a minute. But there's a fundamental difference between the German side on the one hand and, for example, the French and the British that you've already mentioned. And that is, of course, after World War I, where the Germans sit down, they think, okay, what went wrong last time? How can we do it better? How can we be more efficient? How very Germanic when we do these things, because we need to win that next time around. Whereas the others sit down, relax a little bit and say, you know what, it worked, didn't it? The British saying, we don't ever want to do something like this again, so we are only interested in imperial policing. And the French saying, if we have to do something like this again, we're just going to refight the First World War. This is why people like, for example, Charles de Gaulle have a very, very hard time in France trying to push their very innovative and good ideas forward. Whereas in the German case, the military and also the political leadership, once Hitler comes to power, are far more receptive to this because they think here is something not groundbreakingly new. We'll talk about this in a minute. But if we take this concept and apply this, here might be a chance to win the next battle, the next campaign, and that means we might win the next war. But maybe if we look at where it all comes from, so again, look at the whole doctrinal development and the origins of all this. There is a lot of German stuff going on here. That is very, very true. And when you need to understand the German way of fighting, which goes back, you might say, all the way to perhaps even Frederick the Great. You just need to look at the map and you find Germany surrounded by potential and real enemies. And of course, Germany is, if you take all these enemies, it's a very strong country. It's got lots of people. It's got a relatively large military, but surrounded by these enemies, potentially fighting a 2, 3, I don't know how many front war. This can get very, very tricky. So the Germans, you might say, all the way back to the 18th century, say, when we go to war, the way you need to do it, you need to declare war, need to advance into the enemy territory, deal the knockout blow in the first round, just a bit like the boxer, knock out the enemy, and that's the way you win the war. If you play the long game, you are going to lose. Frederick the Great nearly lost. The Germans lose in the First World War. So these are frames of reference for these people. And they say, well, we need to be more aggressive, more offensive. We need to win in the first round. For the Allies, the British, the French, also the Americans, that's a very, very different picture. They say, all we need to do is hold the front line, mobilize the empires, and we are going to win, as we've done the First World War. So here you can already see some of the underlying differences that then play out as you move through the 1920s and the 30s, and then putting all these things quite successfully to the test, and of course, in the late 1930s and early 1940s. But of course, one of the other issues and problems you find with this is a very military strategy. It's not a grand strategy. So Germany wins battle after battle, campaign after campaign, defeats all these enemies, but still doesn't win the war, which I think is quite indicative of these problems that you sometimes also find when you're only concentrating at this very, very military level, which they do quite well, but forgetting about the bigger picture stuff. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
In a word, yes. But I feel like there are a few other aspects I want to inject into it and get your feelings on, see how you react to those. First of all, German efficiency is vastly overrated these days. Have you ever been on a Deutsche Bahn train in the last couple of years?
We're not allowed to talk about this here on this podcast. It's forbidden.
We need to scrub the idea of German efficiency these days from our vocabulary. Anyway, I'm also glad you slipped in potential there for potential enemies, because
Yes.
I could tell you hesitated for a second, like, oh wait, no, potential enemies. I like it. It's very responsible. Very responsible.
Got a long list of enemies. There we go.
So I think in the spirit of this German tradition, this German way of making war, as Robert Citino, for example, American military historian, has written quite a bit about this idea of a big battle of annihilation with big penetrations, with big encirclements, it does have a history. It's not Guderian's idea from Achtung Panzer, the book that he wrote in the interwar period, right? They do it to the French at Sedan in 1870, for example. They kind of try it in 1914 with the Schlieffen Plan, trying to envelop the French army. And on a smaller, but I think not insignificant scale, they kind of try it when they're fighting some of the native peoples in Namibia in 1904. But there is another term in German military thinking called Bewegungskrieg, a war of movement. And I think that's part of this tradition as well. So we've kind of painted over it with the idea of Blitzkrieg for the 39 to 41 period, but the idea of Bewegungskrieg, as you were pointing out, is an older one that's already there. And I think all of this kind of leads us into the direction of, is this discussion about Blitzkrieg, are we trending towards seeing it as an evolution, which I think we are in this little chat we're having right now, or, as some historians have argued, would we consider it a kind of revolution? This is a very common question in history. When there are changes in history, how do you balance them versus the continuity? Are things evolutions or are they revolutions in military affairs in this case, right? And I think, if I understand you right, you, and certainly I think at this stage, are leaning towards seeing the evolutionary aspect that leads to this method of fighting for the Germans.
You're absolutely spot on. So when you look at, as you said, the evolution of all of this, it's very difficult to find something really revolutionary in the German thinking, in the German actions of 1939 to, let's say, 1941. All of what you see played out in the early stages of the Second World War, in theory, in doctrine, and also sometimes in reality, is already there before that. You already mentioned a number of these wars. 1870 is a very famous one, 1870-71 against the French. Of course, in the First World War, the Schlieffen Plan, of course, fails because strategically it's flawed. But when you look at the operational conduct, that is exactly it. So you have, and you use the term Bewegungskrieg, the war of movement. You're trying to outmaneuver the enemy rather than fighting them head on. If you have to do this, you also do it. It does not mean that in this type of doctrine and this type of thinking you shun away from casualties and attrition. But if that can be avoided, that's exactly what you do. And of course, where you see this concept falling down, which I think has kind of confused a number of people, is very much the First World War. Because in order to have this war of movement, you need to have open flanks. You need to be able to outmaneuver the enemy, to fix the enemy at one front and then outmaneuver them, go right flanking, left flanking, whatever it is that you want to do. However, if you have continuous front line all the way from the Channel to the Swiss border, you simply can't outmaneuver people. And you might say that when you then look at the ideas that are being developed and put forward and adopted by the German army in the 1920s and 1930s, this is not groundbreakingly new. This is not something that comes out of the First World War and they say we need to do it very differently. What they do say is, well, we went in the First World War, but actually it didn't really work because we weren't following our own principles because we couldn't anymore. So we need to go back to the original principles, which is war of maneuver, which is outmaneuvering the enemy and defeating the enemy rather than destroying the enemy. So you don't have to kill everybody. That's completely not necessary, because the moment you do this, you enter a war of attrition, and that means you'll have lots of casualties on both sides. So you try to avoid this. You try to outmaneuver, take out the command post, encircle the enemy, force the enemy to surrender. And that's exactly what they're trying to do. And the only reason why people, as I repeat myself, why they think it's a new thing is because in the First World War, This really, really does not happen. Of course, you might say if they'd thought it through a little bit, of course, it doesn't really happen in 1870 either. So they fight all these great battles. They manage to encircle the main French army. The French emperor goes into captivity, surrenders, but the country doesn't surrender. And so suddenly you have a people's war, which led Moltke, the great hero of this particular war, to say in German parliament, well, we're at a watershed, we have a people's war. Wars will be fought very, very differently from now on. So they didn't really quite understand this, or maybe they did but didn't want to see it, because the moment you go into this, the idea of a Blitzkrieg, a Bewegungskrieg, becomes far less convincing and, well, you might say victorious. So there are underlying issues here as well. But I think this is the framework that we need to look at when we think about Blitzkrieg, particularly, of course, in the German military, and that means mainly in the German army. What do you think?
Yeah, I think one little anecdotal aspect that keeps popping up whenever I read about this is just how appealing certain fantasies of a crushing or annihilating victory is for many German military thinkers over time. And by annihilating, I don't necessarily mean kill every last person. That was a bit more the case with Namibia, but it's a bit of an exception. It's a little bit of a different case than the European fighting, although some historians argue it's the other way around, but we're not going there for today, is this idea of a Cannae. This Battle of Cannae in ancient times, right? The Carthaginians managed to trick the Romans, surround them on three sides, and inflict an absolutely crushing defeat. And they do slaughter huge numbers of Romans. So reaching for that fantasy without necessarily going for the whole slaughtering aspect, if it's not necessary, I think it's an interesting aspect. It might even be a potential flaw in German thinking of the time to keep returning to that concept, to that idea. One other aspect that I think is interesting happens in 1939. And I think it goes to this idea that we've been talking about, that the Germans are not alone in this, that others are trying to develop it. The British and French, they never have an occasion to attempt to use these. And as you said, in terms of doctrine, in terms of their way of thinking, they're not ready for this type of thing yet. They're not going to do it unless they're forced to. And by then, in this case of the French, of course, it's too late. But the Soviets make a stab at it. They try in their little border war against the Japanese at the Battle of, and I hope I'm pronouncing this at least halfway understandably, the Battle of Khalkhin Gol, up on the border between the Soviet Union and Manchuria, Mongolia, up there are these clashes. There are a couple of different battles. This is kind of the most famous one. And there the Soviets take their armor and they try a double envelopment by penetrating around Japanese forces. And they are generally successful in that conflict. Now, of course, we know they're going to have huge difficulties in 1941 with command and control. They're going to try to do counterattacks, and they're going to absolutely fall flat on their face. And all their cute little T-26s and BT-7s are going to end up broken down on the side of the road, knocked out because the crews don't know what to do in them, or just knocked out by more skilled Germans. But in 1939, they win a battle based on these kind of practices. And so for me, that's another interesting ingredient in this recipe of thinking about, how new is it and how German is it? Well, the Soviets they did it once before the Germans managed to do it.
I also think that when you fast forward and look at the second half of World War II, I think the Soviets, in many respects, are doing whatever we call Blitzkrieg these days, probably more successfully than any other army that is fighting at that stage. And that is because they did have some of these routes that you just explained. So they're thinking about this. Of course, in Soviet style, they're thinking about this in far more operational detail and at the operational level. So everything is much, much bigger and larger. But the concept, as you said, is pretty much exactly the same. So it's not only German. And of course, we shouldn't forget that in the 1920s and 30s, there's a lot of cooperation between the Germans and the Soviets as well, whether it's tank design, there's the German gas warfare school, there's a German Air Force school, all in the Soviet Union. So there's quite a bit of this interaction going on. And of course, that also means intellectual interaction. So no, it's not all just 100% German. There is a German, you might say, a German root in all this based on geography, the history of Germany and the German military. But of course, there are a number of different influences, and the Germans are not the only ones to do what we call Blitzkrieg these days. I think you're absolutely right on this one.
Now, another aspect of this that always strikes me, because I'm not a doctrine guy. This is not my main focus mostly when I've worked with or read about the Second World War. But you are a doctrine guy, so to speak. So Blitzkrieg, is it really a coherent doctrine that is kind of talked about in that way, where, are the German officers sitting around with Guderian and others saying, hey, yeah, Blitzkrieg, let's talk about that today. And then they go through all the concepts that we've just been discussing about how to fight? Or are the critics of this idea more on the mark that Blitzkrieg was not really a coherent idea and it's something else, something that we might talk about later, if you agree?
It isn't really a coherent approach, a strategy, a doctrine. I think, well, as you say, I'm now putting on very firmly here my doctrine head, my military head. So listeners, please forgive me if you find all this terribly dull and boring. But I think it's quite important to get this right. So when you try to defeat an enemy or destroy an enemy, you got different aspects that you need to look at, and it all comes down to how strong, how successful, how effective, whatever effective really means, is your military. And in the military realm, this is called fighting power. And how do you define fighting power? And there are, as per doctrine, 3 different aspects, and all these together make up the fighting power of your military. I always want to say army because I'm an army man, so please, Air Force and naval people, forgive me. For me, everything is land-based. For me, everyone in uniform is a soldier. So there we go. So if I say army, I mean the military.
Blasphemy.
My apologies.
Blasphemy.
So the first one, of course, is, and that's the doctrinal term, is the physical one. So you need to have men, you need to have material, you need to have kit. If you want to fight a war but you don't have an army, or you have an army but it only has broomsticks, it's quite difficult to win a battle, to win a war. So that's number 1. But then you've got 2 other aspects, and these are quite often forgotten about. The first one is the moral aspect. You can have a very, very strong army, but if this army doesn't really want to fight, and we looked at one of these aspects, this question really, when we looked at France 1940 in a different episode. How could France as a nation, as a country, as an army, as a military collapse so quickly? One of the reasons was that they didn't have the moral component of fighting power. We talked about this, you find it at the tactical level, but as a nation on the whole, it was lacking to a degree. So that makes it difficult. Armies can just disintegrate and disappear because people don't want to fight. And then the last one is the conceptual component of fighting power. And the conceptual component is basically everything that doesn't fit into the other 2. And that means mainly that's doctrine. That's the way you want to fight. How do you actually use the kit that you've got, a motivated army, and how do you employ this? How do you use these people on the battlefield? And this is, you might say, where this whole Blitzkrieg idea comes in. We looked at this in the France 1940 episode. The German army, when they invade France in 1940, they have less tanks, less men, less planes, and particularly less guns than the Allies, and they still win. Because they use what lots of people have called this new doctrine, Blitzkrieg. The Germans would have said, no, there's nothing new at all. All we're doing is going back to tried and tested German operational concepts. And that's exactly what they do. And together with that, we now need to open lots of Pandora's boxes here, really, to look at all this in detail. One of the things that's really important, you mentioned, it's all about command and control. How do you do this? You need to be able to react very quickly on the battlefield because you want to be able to outmaneuver and outthink the enemy. It's all about outthinking. That's the important thing. It's more about outthinking than outfighting. If you outthink the enemy, you don't have to fight. And how can you do this? By using mission command. What does that mean? You give responsibility to the people on the ground. And this is what the Germans did extremely well. You find this in most other doctrines of World War II, particularly in the Western armies. The British Army has it in writing since the First World War, since before the First World War, the man on the spot, as they call it. In reality, I would argue, I know that quite a few people are probably going to disagree with me now, historians of the British Army, I think the British Army didn't do that well. And they certainly didn't do that well in World War II. It takes basically all the way to the 1980s. And this concept is really, really engulfed in the British Army, so quite late in the day. But only if you do this, you can then have a chance of being able to outthink and outmaneuver the enemy. That's called, in doctrinal terms, the OODA loop. It's basically, orient yourself. You arrive at a scene, there's something going on. You see, okay, what's happening? Where are we? Where am I on the map? What am I supposed to be doing? You orient yourself and say, okay, well, this is what's going on. This is what I need to achieve. You then, based on this, you then come to the third point, which is the D, which is decide, and then it's act. And only if you have this idea of mission command, you can constantly outthink, outmaneuver the enemy, go through the OODA loop, as they say, faster than the enemy. And that gives you the upper hand. And that's basically the whole idea behind it. And the Germans were doing that really well. And they had the time, of course, to do that as well. Because in the interwar period, you've got a very small, very professional army, 100,000 men. And all of these were trained 2 levels up. So a company commander knew what the regimental commander's ideas were, what he would have to do, how he would act. He could anticipate his ideas, his thoughts, and could act accordingly. And that gives the Germans the upper hand. So they're extremely well trained. And of course, one thing what you also find is, in inverted commas, for the Germans, it's quite easy to do this, because they can concentrate on planning and fighting and preparing for one type of war. That's a conventional war in Europe. It's far more difficult for the French and the British. You've got the prospect of fighting another major conflict in Europe, but also have to fight in the colonies, which demands a completely different mindset, a different structure. And this is, of course, one of the problems that haunts them in World War II. And this is why the Germans can say it's quite easy for us to outmaneuver them, to outthink them, because the Allies are a little bit on the back foot here, because they have to stretch themselves, both in material terms, but also, you might say, from the point of doctrine and thinking. So that makes it quite difficult for the Allies. In inverted commas, it's easy to say, relatively simple for the Germans. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
I think so, because one of the aspects that kind of, I would say, is a drag on the development of doctrine and implementing these different theories that, say, several British thinkers had, and Charles de Gaulle, and probably a couple of other Frenchmen had, who I'm not as familiar with, is that the Germans know they're going to be fighting pretty much on their own. So they're a cohesive unit, and they can plan for that. And they're also thinking more often about an aggressive war. So they're going to have the initiative, and they'll get to decide what happens first. Whereas the French and British, they have got to fight together. France, there's no way France is planning on a war without Britain, and probably vice versa if it's going to be on the continent. So the idea of a coalition developing a coherent doctrine together, when it's unpredictable, I mean, maybe the British won't join if Germany attacks France. It's very hard to say. They almost didn't in 1914, for example. And in the interwar years, British policies and British priorities took them away from common defense with France for quite some time. So I think that makes it very hard to harmonize doctrine if you're eventually going to be fighting side by side with an ally, but you're not sure 100% that that's going to happen in advance. It makes you more prone, I think, to a conservative approach, to a defensive approach, which, as we've spoken about before, culturally, psychologically, is already where the British and French, and particularly the French, are headed in that interwar period. One other element that I was thinking of when you were speaking that sort of popped into mind is that I think one aspect of what the Blitzkrieg myth and idea that we associate with it is that the Germans expect quick victory, according to Blitzkrieg ideas, right? That's the goal. But many of them didn't expect as quick a victory as what actually happened in France in 1940. So I think that weakens the idea, as we've been chipping away at it, of the myth of Blitzkrieg, or of Blitzkrieg as a coherent doctrine, because they are ready to have a longer war. Many of the generals are concerned, are worried about the decision to go to war, because it might last long, it might be exhausting, it might be a slog. They don't want that to happen. But it is not the assumption that it's going to be fast. It's not the very first kind of, oh yeah, we expect this because that's what our doctrine is going for immediately. Victories, yes, but an absolute collapse within a few weeks, no, not so much. And to me, that dovetails with what some people have argued about the campaign in 1940 in particular, is that it's not a coherent blitzkrieg. It's a result of the ripple effects and the cascade of really good decisions as a part of mission command. You have all these commanders on the ground making these good, quick decisions. It's not something that is exactly planned in advance. And that is what happens, along with a little bit of luck sometimes, along with a bit of a vulnerable enemy who makes some serious mistakes. But I think it was General Kielmansegg one time who said that Blitzkrieg was simply ad hoc solutions that popped out of the prevailing situation. Do you think that's kind of giving this military thinkers on the German side short shrift, or do you think there's something to that idea that they kind of improvise themselves into a quick victory that wasn't really planned that way?
Well, when you go back and look at, for example, what Moltke the Elder had to say, the big hero of the German Wars of Unification in the 19th century, he said basically war planning, well, war is just a system of expedients. For exactly that reason, you can't plan these things in advance, and all you need to be able to do is to be able to, as I said earlier, within this OODA loop, whether it's at the tactical level, the operational, strategic level, just be quicker than the enemy. And I think that's also very, very important. Quite often we think that in order to win in war, you need to have the best army in the world. It needs to be absolutely perfect. Well, no. Within this concept of fighting power, these three aspects that I mentioned, you just need to be better than your opponent. That's an important factor. And I think we quite often forget about this. And when you look at what the Germans do in the early stage of the war, you can actually be, I would say, be more critical than you have been. So that this is unusual. So I'm very critical of the Germans now. That's not what I'm supposed to be doing here in this podcast, but there we go. You look at what happens in the Poland campaign, for example. So yes, of course, Poland is defeated relatively quickly. You have all these ideas in Poland before the war breaks out. We'll be in Berlin in 2 weeks' time and what have you. That, of course, doesn't happen. And there's an obvious reason for that. The Polish army is no match for the German army. And let's not forget, then also the Soviet army, which of course also invades from the east. So this campaign is over relatively quickly. And most people, even historians and people who are interested in World War II, just brush over and say, yeah, Poland, that just happened. And of course it happened. And what else could the outcome have been? When you look at what goes on in Poland, it's absolutely fascinating. For example, the battle for Warsaw. Fighting in built-up areas and fighting in woods and forests is nothing that you want to do if you want to have, let's use the term again, Bewegungskrieg, because it fixes you, it slows you down, it causes lots of casualties. When the Germans go and fight the Battle of Warsaw, they don't have a doctrine for urban fighting because they don't think they do it. They base, well, one division that goes in there bases its approach to the lessons learned from the fight of the German army against the Spartacus uprising just after the First World War. We have an uprising in Berlin, a left-wing uprising. That's basically what they use because that's all they have. They don't want to do this. They're quite bad at this, actually. And when you look at the after-action reports that come out, they're put together by the German High Command, and they're in the archives in Freiburg, so you can read them. And it's the general after-action report and lessons learned from the Poland campaign. And they actually state very, very clearly that, yes, it worked against the Polish army. However, they say the structure, the approach, the training, all of this would not have worked against a first-rate enemy like the French or the British army. They're extremely critical of their performance because they know this is what we need to do, but there are all sorts of shortcomings. The army isn't fully motorized. This interaction, the combined arms doesn't really work. The joint doesn't really work. The Air Force at that stage is not particularly good at supporting the army. All this gets much, much better. But at that stage, they're not impressed with their own performance. And you might say in many ways, what then saves the German army is the fact that you then have this period of the Drôle de Guerre, the phony war, the Sitzkrieg, when nothing happens really on the Western Front. And they sit down, they look at the lessons learned. There's a very rigorous retraining program that the Germans go through, really trying to learn all these lessons before they then attack again in France in 1940. And of course, to use the non-official tactical term, but I don't want to use this to smash the enemy and defeat the enemy forces. But very, very, very critical of their own performance. So there's a very steep learning curve on the German side as well, which I think a lot of people don't really know it's there, because everyone thinks Blitzkrieg is here as a concept, they apply it, and immediately it works. Far from it. It's far more difficult for the Germans as well.
And that makes me think of language, because to me, that's another fascinating part of this story. We're so familiar with this word, Blitzkrieg, lightning war. But if it were such a developed, coherent strategy, then the Germans would probably be talking about it that way, but they're not, right? Very, very seldom do you ever find the word Blitzkrieg in any German records from the interwar period or from the early years of the war. There's a couple of references to it, but usually that's just a descriptive reference to a war that doesn't last long, not a certain way of fighting the war, like the one that we've been talking about and you've been explaining. For example, Hitler himself in November 41, and now Blitzkrieg by that time has been used in the press and so on, he says, "I have never used the word Blitzkrieg because it is a completely idiotic word." And I mean, that's coming straight from the horse's mouth. So if it were a coherent doctrine, you'd think he wouldn't have that kind of reaction to it, right? So what some historians have tried to explain is, well, then how did the word come about? And there's an idea that, well, in order to try to explain, to try to put into words the shock of what happened with the defeat of France in 1940, journalists in the Allied countries sort of used this term as a catch-all kind of thing. But then there's also evidence linking it to German propaganda, that once they had these unexpected successes, however you want to explain them in detail and whatever learning curves and evolutionary aspects there were, to the Nazi propagandists, you want to have a catchword. You want to have a buzzword that you can project out to your own population, and of course, in a way, to the enemy population as well, to demoralize them. And so they start talking about Blitzkrieg and look at this wonderful Blitzkrieg we just had, and we're unstoppable because we have Blitzkrieg, and so on and so forth. And this has led some historians to be quite definitive. Now, I don't know if we want to go that far on our podcast today, but nonetheless, I'm going to quote one historian, Michael Geyer, who says, "As an operational design, Blitzkrieg was a make-believe spectacle that was put together in hindsight for public consumption." Too harsh, or is he kind of onto something as far as using the label is concerned?
I think when he used the label, he's probably correct. You already explained why it's good to use this label. It's useful for the Germans at that time. But let's face it, it's also very useful for the Allies to use that term. Because if you in 1940 get hit by something completely new that you didn't know was there, and they're coming completely from the left flank, so to speak, and you're completely puzzled by what's going to happen or what did happen, well, of course you couldn't react to this. And of course you got defeated. And of course, well, France is defeated and the BF is thrown back into the sea. So here's the answer to that. Well, no one knew that was happening because they are so advanced, so quick, so new, so everything, that there was no chance to counter these moves. Which, of course, as we, I think, have discussed and as we probably know, is not really quite true. Because it is, as you said a few minutes ago, it's more of an evolution rather than a revolution. And when you look at the German war plans, you already said, you already mentioned the long-term idea about, or long-term plan for the campaign in France, 1940. The first plan that the High Command comes up with looks pretty much like the First World War plan, and they are expecting some sort of trench warfare somewhere in Belgium, somewhere in France. So they're not particularly confident they're going to win this. The only strategic advantage, of course, they have in 1940 is that they wouldn't be fighting a two-front war because Germany was allied with the Soviet Union. But as a pure operational design and plan, they're not particularly confident. They're very, very confident that at the tactical level, they're better trained and they can probably outthink and outmaneuver the enemy. But that needs to translate into operational victories. And to achieve that, that is very, very, very difficult. And in a way, you might perhaps also say this is also one of the weak spots of this entire concept on the German side. We've talked about the Russians and the Soviets a little bit, who tend to concentrate very much on the operational level. For them, it's the deep battle. It's the deep, dark drive into the enemy's hinterland. They don't really care about what happens at the tactical level. To a degree, you can see that being played out today in the Ukraine. They're quite willing to accept casualties because they know tactically they're not particularly good. The important thing is the operational success. On the German side, in many respects, it's the other way around. It's all about tactical success and tactical excellence. And they're quite good at this, again, compared to the enemy, but this needs to translate into something else. And sometimes they really do struggle with that. And you might say in France 1940, which is always seen as the prime example of this Blitzkrieg in action. That's why we keep talking about this quite a bit also in this podcast here. They do that, but then, of course, the fact that the enemies collapse so quickly, there's also a bit of luck and also some other things that play a role here. So it's not only about the tactical excellence, you need to bring all this together. And this is, of course, where they struggle when you then move forward and move, for example, into the Soviet Union. And look at what happens there. This is the best example. So tactically, if you want to call that brilliant, some people have also questioned that, whether the Germans are so brilliant at the tactical level. Operationally, yes, you've got these huge pockets. However, the Soviets simply don't surrender. And the moment they don't surrender, you might say, well, this is, of course, the problem, how Blitzkrieg doctrine fails. Because it is based on, as he said earlier, the idea that you go in there, you encircle the enemy, and they will just surrender. And Goebbels, he writes about this. And he says, well, the war in the East is actually going, yeah, it's going well, but how are we having some problems here because our casualties are mounting? He said the problem is, and he says, well, these stupid Russians, because they're not educated, they don't know how these things work. They are surrounded, but they keep fighting. They need to get killed. And of course, that means we have lots of casualties. And then he says the French, on the other hand, as an educated people, they knew when they were defeated, and they simply surrendered. And you can see how this concept is beginning to fall down here. And of course, well, that's the beginning of, you might say, the downfall of the war in the East, which of course leads to the downfall of Nazi Germany in World War II. So it's very, very complex. It is also interesting when you look at this question. I wouldn't call it Blitzkrieg because I think we've debunked the myth of the Blitzkrieg doctrine, the ideology of Blitzkrieg, you might say. But this whole idea of Bewegungskrieg, the war of movement, how this is still being played out in armies today and how different armies still do it very differently, perhaps to a degree, coming back to this whole idea and myth and getting carried away that we talked about earlier. And my prime example is always being on a military staff ride where you stand in a field, you look at what happened during a particular war, and then you use what happened there as a starter for discussion of the military of today, of doctrine, how you would do things today in a similar scenario. And there was one episode which was really, really quite eye-opening. It was an international staff ride. We had British officers there, and American and French and Americans and Germans. And did I say Americans twice?
Maybe there were 2 times as many Americans in the group. That's okay.
That's possible. Who knows? So they had to deal with this scenario where they were supposed to fight delaying action, then build up reserves, and then launch a counterattack with overwhelming force. And all the armies, particularly the US Army and the French Army, quite methodical. You might say wanting to refight the First World War did exactly that. The British kind of sitting on the fence, not entirely sure. And what's really interesting when you look at what the Germans were doing, in every single syndicate, they had a chance to talk about this before to prepare an answer or something like this. But the scenario was that the troops were down to about 65% of their fighting power, their combat strength. And they were supposed to get reinforced, which would take them back to 100%. And all the armies were planning for this, delaying action in mines and this, and deny the approach marches, and then build up a force and counterattack. And all the Germans and all their syndicates said, okay, that is fine, you do this. We attack in 5 minutes. And everybody else was very confused about why are you doing this? And they said, no, you misunderstand. You're saying we have only got 65% of our combat strength left. We say we still have 65%. If we attack immediately, we are able to outthink, outwit, outmaneuver the enemy. Coming back to this idea of OODA loop and things that we talked about earlier, this is worth far more than an additional 35% of combat strength. So I thought that was really interesting that even today, in different armies, all NATO countries, armies still do things slightly differently. That was a bit of an eye-opener, I have to say.
And I think this psychological aspect about expectations and how they evolve is quite interesting, because there's a lot of apprehension, as we've talked about, before they start the campaign against Poland, because they're worried about the Franco-British reaction, but especially before the invasion of France. And of course, it works out much better than almost any German expected, no matter whether he's a politician or a general. And then, in many cases anyway, let's say to use a colloquial North American term, they drink their own Kool-Aid. And so they kind of get high on their own supply. I can just keep these going for a long time. But they get drunk on success in some cases. I'm not trying to say they became fools. They're still professional soldiers. They still have the same skills of grasping how to fight a war as they did before. But there is the intention, and in many cases, the expectation of a short war in 1941, which is closer to this label of Blitzkrieg, to this propaganda caricature of the type of war fighting. So some historians have argued that by having the success against France, by being exposed to the idea of the glorious and super efficient and effective German Blitzkrieg in Nazi public discourse and newspapers and propaganda and so on, that some of them kind of absorb that and feel, yeah, that is what we're trying to do now. So that's a very interesting cultural evolution in the development of how this type of fighting plays out. For example, before Operation Barbarossa starts, there are a couple of absolutely, in hindsight, deliciously ironic quotes from Jodl, for example, Alfred Jodl. He says the USSR is going to pop like a pig's bladder. Obviously, it's not really a metaphor we would relate to that much today. I've seen pigs' bladders, but I grew up on a pig farm, and most of you listeners probably didn't. But back in the day, pig bladder popping, I guess, was something that Jodl felt people would understand. I think it was Halder, if my memory serves, who said that the campaign in the Soviet Union is going to be a Sandkastenspiel compared to France. So a game, basically, compared to France. It's going to be a piece of cake compared to France. And then Hitler's order, I think it's, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Matthias, I think it's order number 18, where he kind of lays out the orders to, we're going to invade the Soviet Union. It calls for a decisive and short, victorious campaign. So they have kind of internalized this idea of the myth of Blitzkrieg themselves. And there's a great quote from a historian by the name of Doty, who wrote a great article on the topic that I read before this podcast. Just spoiler alert, I don't know all this stuff off the top of my head all the time.
Don't give it away.
Despite what my grandmother believed and for the whole time. He says, in one of the greatest ironies of military history, the Germans fell victim to their own myth, or perhaps more correctly, to their own disinformation campaign. They came to believe their press releases, movies, and propaganda, concluding that since they had intended to use Blitzkrieg against the French and had done so successfully, they could be just as successful against the Soviets. Is that going too far?
I think that is spot on. I would even call it hubris that sets in the German case. I think that word sums it up quite nicely. And again, you need to understand the context here. So in 1940, the Germans have just defeated France. Think about the context. So all these generals had fought in the First World War. In the First World War in the West, they couldn't win, and they're defeated. And suddenly, in a campaign that only really lasted 6 weeks, they managed to defeat pretty much all of the Western allies, if you include Belgium, the Netherlands, and the BF. But of course, the main enemy really is France. And suddenly, they get carried away. And this campaign that hadn't been planned as a Blitzkrieg, whatever that means, as we've discussed, but they do some of sort of this Bewegungskrieg, and they win. And when you look at what then happens in 1941, when they go into the Soviet Union, it is really the first time that you have a fully planned, let's call it Blitzkrieg. 6 to 8 weeks, defeat the Soviet Union, no need for winter equipment, because by the time the winter sets in, the troops will have won, they're back in Germany, preparing for the fight against Britain or making peace, whatever they would do. So they really get carried away, and there's pure hubris that sets in. Of course, what you also need to understand is when you look at the Soviet Union, that was seen as a very, very weak society, country, and military. You've already given a number of quotes. There's another famous one where Hitler says, well, all you need to do is, kick in the door and the entire rotten structure will come tumbling down. That was the expectation, because don't forget, you had the purges in the Soviet army. All the experienced commanders have gone. They fought a quite disastrous war against Finland in 39-40. In the end, they kind of won, but it was not particularly impressive what they did, to be perfectly honest there. So you've got all these issues and problems. And when the Germans invade, when you look at the reports that the Western defense attaches write back from Moscow, they're expecting Moscow to fall within 6 weeks. So that's the general expectation. But yes, with the benefit of hindsight, it is hubris that sets in, and the Germans completely get carried away. They completely, for example, forget about logistics. They really get this wrong. It was, in inverted commas, easy in France, where you have a very good infrastructure, good roads, a good railway network, very different in the Soviet Union. They simply did not pay enough attention to that. And of course, we all know the outcome of that. So yes, hubris, well, beware of hubris is all I can say if you want to win a war. And never invade Russia.
Wise words to end the podcast today. So to round things up, we've been talking about the whole concept of Blitzkrieg, especially as it's understood kind of in the popular consciousness. Maybe it's a bit of a myth, right? I think our discussion today, we more or less are moving in the direction that it's not exclusively a German idea to fight the way that the Germans do in 1939 to 1941. It's not a brand new thing. It's got its origins and its connections to other earlier times and longer period thinking of German thought as well, and in other countries as well. It's not necessarily labeled as a coherent doctrine either. There's an evolutionary aspect even during the war, and they don't use that terminology the way that we might assume that they would now. And of course, Guderian was not the only one involved in thinking about these kinds of war-fighting concepts. So, thank you, Matthias, for sharing your expertise today, once again, on the podcast. Listeners out there, hope you enjoyed that. If you've got an opinion, if you feel we got something wrong, if you read something that just absolutely we have to take into account on one of our future podcasts, let us know, leave us a comment, and until next time. You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening.